what white privilege does. I'm going to talk about what white privilege has looked like in my own life, and I wrote this essay, and I'm just going to read it through. And I wrote it because a friend of mine she asked me to talk about how I became an ally, and I'm like, well, I don't actually know if I'm there yet. I don't think any people of color have called me an ally yet, so I'm not going to call myself that. But I do think I've come to some awareness of my own racist background, and I'm trying to own that so I can move forward from it. This begins with a quote by a Japanese writer named Shusaku Endo, and he writes, "Sin is not what it is usually thought to be, is not to steal and tell lies. Sin is for one person to walk brutally over the life of another and to be quite oblivious of the wounds they have left behind." The day after the 2016 election, one of my students, a woman of African American and Latina heritage, came to my classroom sobbing. I felt sick over what my country had done the night before, and sick over the discord I was now experiencing between myself and family members who voted differently. But my student was terrified for her safety. While we sat in my classroom, cried some, and talked, she looked up at one point and said, "Do minorities' lives matter?" Maybe I gasped out loud. I certainly did inside. "Of course it matters," I told her, crying. But I was crying out of guilt. I have never asked that question of myself. I have wondered if life matters or if my life matters, but I've never wondered if the existence of white women matters. Entire economies are built around white women. Useless but very real standards of beauty are developed around women with blonde hair and blue eyes, like me. Of course we matter. I'd never stopped to think about how perhaps my existence had been amplified at the expense of, or at least the ignoring of, people of color. When I was 9, my parents decided to send me to a homeschool day at the Christian Middle School in Dayton. There, I learned to sit in a desk, whether or not I was done with my work. I learned to wear a dress all day and ask permission to go to the cold green bathroom. And I learned that in a class of 20 children, one girl didn't look like me. Her name was Gina, and she was of mixed African American and white ancestry. I had flat blonde hair and blue eyes, and she had voluminous hair, either floating around her head or pulled back in braids. However, like me, Gina was homeschooled. Like me, she was also an introvert, so this was a good enough of a standard of friendship for me, and good enough for an invitation to my 10th birthday party. On the day of the party, my mother opened the door to Gina and her African American mother. I'm sure my mother was kind, but I also know she was surprised, which I later internalized into a family rule. We need to know if your friends are different. My mother still thinks it's funny that I didn't mention Gina was black. I prefer to remember this story as proof I wasn't racist as a child, but innocent and progressive even in my childhood. I'd forgotten the story until last spring, when I heard Kelly Brown Douglas, an African American Episcopal priest, professor of religion, and author, state that the best thing a white person can hope to be is a recovering racist. I bristled and thought of Gina, until Douglas added that being a recovering racist is kind of like being a recovering alcoholic. As long as I live, I will carry that tendency towards racism in my genes. I knew this was true, and I thought of myself at age 12. In middle school, I, still homeschooled and introverted, loved horses. That summer, my parents sent me to a horse camp for a week in rural Ohio. Almost all of the staff were white, with the exception of one African American man. Even though it was June, the theme of the week was Valentine's Day, and we were all secretly given a Valentine that we were supposed to do kind things for. I was paired up with a black man, and I was terrified of him. I was terrified of most men, but I know my terror had something to do that in the 2 years since I'd become friends with Gina, I'd internalized the idea of black people as somehow scary and other. I heard my grandmother regularly comment that it was the blacks who had ruined Dayton. My own father rolled his eyes when Martin Luther King Jr. Day came around. When I asked why, my parents just said, well, he caused a lot of trouble. And I began to realize that talking about race meant the same thing as causing trouble, and that was bad. During the end of that week at horse camp, the African American man tried to strike up a conversation with me, proudly knowing he was my Valentine. I hadn't done anything nice for him. I felt bad, but mostly I felt fear. From what I remember, I responded by trying to ignore him. In recent years, I've begun to teach more students of color, and in the process, I've begun to spend more time with them outside of class too. These students are African American, Hispanic, Filipino, Asian, Puerto Rican. They tell me about being pulled over by the police, being called a poor minority on welfare for working for campus food service, being called Foxy Brown for wearing their hair natural. But more frustratingly, they tell me of being ignored. One Filipino American student tells me that when she came to the university in the fall of 2014, a classmate had told her he didn't consider her to be a real American, even though they were both born in Lexington, Kentucky. However, that comment did not disturb her as much as the university-wide silence on Black Lives Matter in Ferguson. That silence was toxic, she says, and it hurts. I just want to be heard, an African American student told me over frozen yogurt last summer. As a student of color at a mostly white university, she is certainly seen. But despite her extroverted, cheerful personality, she often stays silent in class. She feels she always needs to keep her head down, keep her grades up, and keep her opinions to herself. When she gradually begins to voice some of her concerns about the treatment of her fellow students of color, she tries to not complain, portray herself as a victim, or speak too aggressively. I can empathize with this last part. When I post another article about white privilege, I can imagine my family members reading it in disgust. When my students struggle to discuss diversity in class, I imagine them mentally writing their scathing end-of-semester evaluations. When I do occasionally say the phrase Black Lives Matter, I fear that people who I don't even know won't like me. And those people in my head are always white. The Apostle John writes that perfect love casts out fear, and I imagine I am perhaps loving imperfectly because the imaginary white people in my head can seem louder and more important to me than the very real students I hope to love. Students who say that ignoring racism hurts more than being openly racist. Students who hear silence and ask if their lives matter. Students watching the good white people